there was always gender nonconforming, for want of a better word. You might call it sex nonconforming children. So they didn't need language to tell them that. I was one of those kids.
You do have the absolute right to say whatever you want on Twitter, and everyone else has the absolute right to argue with you if they want to.
So this was a tense conversation between two women, both experienced campaigners and commentators on the harms of gender ideology, seemingly fighting for the same cause to protect children primarily from this idea that they can change sex or that they have an internal kind of sexed soul within them. Kara Dansky is a campaigner and the author of The Abolition of Sex. She maintains that language is really important in this fight, using words like trans woman, trans man, trans child, using words like he for a woman, she for a man, to be polite or courteous or sensitive to their idea of their internal gender. This is all entrenching the problem. Stella O'Malley says no. She is a psychotherapist who herself suffered from gender dysphoria and really understands that experience. And she went on to set up Spect, which works with young people and families to stop them going down that permanent medicalized route to respond to their gender dysphoria. She says this isn't about language and splitting hairs over what words people use. This is about preventing the actual physical and psychological harm to young people. Great. Stella O'Malley, Kara Dansky, thanks so much for hanging out with me for the next hour. How are you both?
Good.
I'm good. Thanks so much for having both of us.
What are you both focusing on right now in each of your areas of work? Kara, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks. So I'm currently the president of the U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International, which works to advance the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights throughout law, policy, and practice all over the world. And our chapter is focused on sex-based rights in the United States at federal level and all 50 states. I'm also currently promoting my book, The Reckoning: How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. And I present all of the information in that book coming from a leftist, Democrat, radical feminist background. So those are my two main projects right now. And I'm working on a Substack.
Great, thanks. Stella, tell us what's going on with Spect at the moment.
So Spect is focusing on what we have been focusing on really all along, which is promoting a non-medicalized approach to gender diversity. There's been an awful lot of talk recently, and I'd like to get into this lately, as if we don't have a focus, and it couldn't be clearer, a non-medicalized approach to gender diversity in whatever way that manifests. We are, to that end, we've created a gender framework. So we decided not to create a document that would be a standards of care or any sort of medical document, because we don't think gender diversity needs a standards of care. We'd be uneasy producing anything that suggests you need some sort of medicalized approach to gender diversity. And so that's why we've created a framework, and it's a very hefty document, and we've released a draft version, and we'll be releasing the full version, the peer-reviewed version, in September, because we have an ongoing campaign where we follow WPATH around the world. WPATH are the HQ really for medical transition of gender diverse people.
So just because we'll talk about WPATH in a second. So your framework of care, is that intended to encourage other psychotherapeutic practices to engage with gender dysphoria in a way that doesn't lead children down a medical path?
Yeah, it does that among other things. So the gender framework is a large concept, because I'm a psychotherapist. Everybody thinks everything that Spect does is a psychotherapist bent, and that's a leap if you follow me. So Spect is just offering a non-medicalized approach to gender diversity. So that means we have a chapter about schools and families and law. There's a chapter on law, there's a chapter on schools and families. There is a chapter on psychology, but there's also a chapter on biology and theories. And there's also a chapter on society where we bring in prisons. So just because I'm a psychotherapist, there's been kind of a presumption that everything Spect does is psychological. And honestly, I'm like a psychotherapist who's lost its faith, like a priest who's lost his faith. I feel psychotherapy is very badly lost its way. I'm a big advocate of Abigail Schreier's new book, Bad Therapy. I think there's an awful lot of bad therapy. So no, to presume that it's all about psychology is missing the point. There's cultural, there's sociology, there's all law, there's all sorts of other issues. So that's the gender framework. But I just want to go on to say our campaign is we follow WPATH around the world. Wherever they run a conference, we run a conference. And we do that because they've had a campaign of no debate. And we didn't know how to handle it. We're only 3 years old. We didn't know how to handle the campaign of no debate. How do we respond to the fact that we're stifled every time we speak with this no debate? If you go onto the radio, like, you know, if they just don't debate, they just say nothing and they keep going. And so how we chose to handle that was to have conferences wherever they have conferences. So they had a conference in Killarney in Ireland. We had a conference in Killarney in Ireland. They had a conference in Denver, Colorado. We had it. So at the same time, the same place, in the same town, we have a conference to show other views of gender diversity, that it doesn't have to be a fast track to medicalization. And so we're going to have a conference in Lisbon, in Portugal, in September, because they'll be having a conference in Lisbon, Portugal in September. And we're going to have the fully, you know, the peer-reviewed version of the gender framework for access. You know, it's fully accessible right now, but it's the draft version. And so if anybody wants to put in their comments, please put in your comments. We only got about 2 more weeks left for the public commentary. And after that, we're getting it into the peer review. So yeah, I don't know if I've lost myself.
Okay, yeah.
Because I'm constantly being told this is too complicated, and I don't see the complication.
That's a good clarification there, because I thought it was mainly therapeutic, and it's more of a civic framework, including approaches to therapy. Okay, so
if you looked at it, if you opened it up, you'd see immediately with the chapters. There's only 1 chapter out of 5 chapters in psychology.
So, Cara, what you're campaigning for is essentially is at odds with the kind of WPATH culture and framework. Is that correct?
So let me say a little bit about the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights as a way of getting to that. So the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights was launched in New York, having been written primarily by Sheila Jeffreys, among others, in the UK in early 2019. And it sets out 9 articles. And the first of those articles really concretizes the importance of sex as opposed to so-called gender identity in law and throughout society. I won't go through all 9 articles, but I will say that Article 9 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights focuses on the rights of the child. And it's very clear that WDI as an organization globally, including in the US, opposes any form of child so-called transition with respect to, in accordance with Article 9 of the Declaration. However, Articles 1 through 8 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights are focused more exclusively on rights that pertain to women and girls as a sex class. So we've got reproductive integrity, anti-surrogacy, motherhood as a sex class, freedom of expression and opinion, freedom of assembly, the right to participate in politics, the right to single-sex sports, and the elimination of violence against women. So we're really more focused on a political and legal movement to secure women's sex-based rights, of which the protection of children is one.
And so this week, obviously, or last week, with the release of these kind of horrific stories from the Wath Files, things that people like yourself and many following this knew pretty much was happening already: mass medical malpractice, children being given hormone blockers that cause cancer, life-altering vaginoplasties, leaving them with untreatable wounds, essentially loss of sexual pleasure for the rest of their lives. But more tellingly, I think what came out of that was the fact that this was happening without these individuals understanding fully the implications of the treatment that they were getting, under some sort of ideological, psychological belief system that they would be uniting their inner gender with their kind of biological reality that was causing them their suffering.
Well, I think, if I could jump in, I think it's worse than that, in that what the Wath Files exposed is that they were doing this knowingly. Yes, many of us have been working on this for a very long time. I have an entire section of chapter 6 of my book that is devoted to talking about the history of Wath, what it's been doing, how much it's grounded in a business model, and how it's really harming children, the evolution of the standards of care, particularly from standards of care 7, which was the previous one, to standard of care 8, which it's well known by now that standards of care 8 abandons any safeguarding for minors and creates this appalling idea of a eunuch as a gender identity. And as you say, lots of us have known about this for a very long time, but I think the power of the Wath Files and what it exposes is that the clinicians within Wath, or I should say the members of Wath, they're not all clinicians, the members of Wath have done what they've done knowing that they are not getting informed consent from minors, adolescents, and many vulnerable adults. I don't know if Stella would agree with that.
Well, yeah. Michael Shellenberger, released his talk about the Wath Files in November in our conference in Denver. And he was the keynote speaker, and he did a very powerful first line, which is, the name of my talk is How Wath Ends. This is a malignant organization that has caused a huge amount of harm to a huge amount of very vulnerable people, and not only vulnerable people, but also children. And they have, they're fundamentally, as Cara said, this is a consumer-driven organization, and they're treating patients as customers who can buy their care. And they purposely, for example, took out the word experimental from their standards of care so that there'd be insurance. You know what I mean? So that they know exactly what they're doing, and they are propagating an idea that among the most vulnerable people in society, that they can become a different person with a different identity and a different, body, and it doesn't work out, and they know they're causing harm. They know they're causing harm, and some of the excerpts from the Wath Files are horrifying. And I've been very honored to be working with Michael for some months now, preparing for the release of the Wath Files. And it's been a burden. It's been a pretty stressful time, to be honest, but I'm just thrilled they're out, because it exposes this awful organization. I feel I'd love to know how many, but there's about maybe 5,000 people worldwide, like me, you, and Cara here, who know what's going down and who are very aware of what's going down. And we know it's something awful is happening, and it's a medical scandal, but worse than that, it's a cultural scandal. It's a political legal scandal. And most people don't know about it. And if they knew about it, they'd say no. There's no doubt about that. And I think what's great about the Wath Files is the effort Mike was put into making sure that he kept it with, this is malpractice that's happening. And you can talk about all the other points all you want. The fact is malpractice, and they know it. Sorry, I'm ranting, but yeah, I very much agree that this is a terrible organization that needs to be closed.
So this is what I really wanted to ask you both. This is being framed as mass medical malpractice, as a lack of duty of care, but you've both we've all alluded to the fact that this is actually a cultural or ideological movement that's resulted in medical malpractice, has been co-opted and has been exploited for corporate purposes, essentially. So let's talk about the issue of ideology and language that underpins that. How does somebody arrive, a young, vulnerable person, thinking that they are getting psychological and therapeutic treatment, believing that they are going to have a transformative experience of the construct of who they are, when actually what they're getting is very toxic and harmful treatment and more of that toxic ideology? How does that happen? Because many are now focusing on the issue of language. Is this about language and coercion into a belief system? Stella, why don't you keep going, and then we'll come back to Cara.
I will keep going. I think it's a very unfortunate swing that suddenly happened, that people are saying this is a language-based movement, when I would say very strongly this is a material movement. I don't care whether you call that man sie, zer, zit, she, her, him. The fact is, he shouldn't be allowed into a female prison. And so for people to pretend that it's a linguistic movement is frankly bowing into Judith Butler's extraordinary conceptual ivory tower, where apparently if you say it, it is. when I'm very interested in the reality of what it is. I don't care what people say. I don't care what language they use. I care what is the actual physical reality of what's actually happening. And it's the very same for medical transition. They can believe whatever they want. The fact is it weakens their body and it causes sexual infertility and it causes sexual impairment. You know what I mean? So I want us to very much base our reality on reality. And when we get fixated, anybody who understands, obviously I come from a psychological mindset, even if you follow me, whether I'm a priest who's lost his faith, I am psychologically driven. And I think anybody who fixates on language is generally operating from a coping mechanism. It's a defense mechanism to avoid often getting into further truths. You're kind of all about the language, and I'm going to keep on talking about she, her, she, her, she, her, rather than talking about the actual thing that's going down. And I think we have to talk about the reality and think truth and reality, objective reality, is the North Star. Everything else is very interesting conceptually, and we can disagree about things. I'm perfectly happy to disagree with people and say, you go your way, it's very interesting and you might be right. I'll go my way and I think it's interesting and I might be right. But you can't play with reality. If somebody says somebody is she, her, that does not make them she, her. They either are or they aren't.
Sure, but how does a young person become fixated on the idea that they have an inner gender, an internal sexed soul, without using words like gender, like trans woman, like transition, like gender dysphoria?
Well, I'll tell you how, because if you look at history, there was always gender nonconforming, for want of a better word. You might call it sex nonconforming children. So they didn't need language to tell them that. I was one of those kids. I didn't need language. I didn't need gender identity. I didn't even know what the concept was. If you'd asked me what's gender, I wouldn't have known what it was. I don't know what I was, though. I was a kid who really needed to be a boy, and I wasn't. And I was furious about it. And while it's not common, it has been a consistent thing in history, especially among gay, lesbian, and bisexual, but not only, that those children, and that they don't know. I'm talking about me in Dublin in the 1970s and 80s. I didn't know anything. So I'm the reality of defying your idea that you won't know what gender is unless you know the word gender. No, I didn't.
Aren't you an example of the opposite? Someone who experienced those very normal experiences in adolescence that lots of people do, but was not sponsored and coerced by a culture with a linguistic framework that would have you believe that there was a way out of any kind of dysphoric or disassociative experience that you had, and into some sort of gender utopia where you would transition.
Yeah, I'm fully aware that like social contagion happens and semantic contagion happens. What Ian Hacking wrote about some years ago was very interesting, that when you give a condition a name, it spreads the concept. So anorexia is a very good example. Before, anorexia was known in the 60s or 70s, really it was a vanishingly rare concept that nobody really, it was tiny numbers.
But the word anorexia doesn't allude to an internal fat soul that is actually fat. That's actually
but the word anorexia does allude to an internal mindset that they are thin, they should be thin, when actually there isn't any grounding reality. They could be very, very skinny. They can have a very distorted perception of reality.
But the word itself is from outside of that reality. It's saying you are experiencing a subjective belief about yourself and your weight that is not connected to the rest of the world. Whereas gender, by definition, even me saying their gender or my gender, I don't think I have a gender identity, but that self-belief is now completely absent, at least from public life. We all have a gender identity, and that has been cultivated through language. No,
we don't necessarily have a gender identity. What we do have is we have the reality that there's been a small number, and I'm not talking about adolescents who are very much prone to a social contagion. I'm talking about children who have consistently not wanted to be their sex. Okay? Now you can call it whatever you like, but it exists. And pretending it doesn't exist is frankly falsifying history. It's falsifying my existence and what happened to me. And just to continue on from that, it used to be called gender identity disorder. And, you know, that was quite an interesting phrasing. And if you wanted to call it sex dysphoria, I just think of me when I was 3, and it wasn't based around my vagina, and it wasn't based around my, somebody else's penis. So it feels that there was definitely a social construct that was annoying me. It wasn't just the physical. I wanted to be the social as well. And so I can see why it ended up being something that it was more a social construct, which is gender. Now, honestly, I think these are really interesting questions. I'm very keen to hear what Cara has to say. But I do want to point out the fact that so many people on my own side think I'm some sort of she-devil because I hold this view is very, very destructive to a movement that needs to pull together, sort themselves out, and realize there are villains in this movement, and it's not me.
So there's a lot in what both of you have said. I think one really good question that the question highlights is the extent to which there is a movement, right? We talk about like the movement or a movement, and I'm not sure that there is a cohesive movement. And if I'm right, to the extent that there isn't one, then there isn't division within a movement, right? But that's kind of a separate question that maybe we could go back to. You're right. I am one of the people who thinks that language is very important, but it's not because I think reality isn't important. It's because I think there's a tremendous overlap between language and reality. We could explore that more if you'd like, but I also want to get back to your original question, which is how are these kids becoming so confused, and how are they getting infused with the idea that they actually are the opposite sex? Now, whether or not Stella's right that that has always happened, and I'm willing to assume for the sake of discussion that she is, I know this is happening elsewhere, but I can tell you that schools in the United States are absolutely, completely captured by the teaching of the idea that sex isn't real, that anyone can be either a girl or a boy, that it's almost arbitrary, and or even more pernicious, that if you are a girl who likes to play with trucks and have short hair, that you're actually a boy. I know this isn't a surprise to either of you, but it is so deeply, insidiously entrenched in American schools that of course these kids are confused. You know, of course they are. They're being lied to by teachers, many of whom don't want to go along with it, but are required to by their schools and school districts, many of whom do want to go along with it, unfortunately. The parents are mostly completely in the dark, although that's changing. And so by the time a kid reaches late childhood or early adolescence, if this kid has gone to a counselor or gone to a school nurse or something and said, I'm stressed out about my gender, now that's not language that I would ever use, because I don't think that gender is a thing a person has. That's a separate question. But kids today are being taught unquestionably that gender or gender identity is a thing a person has. And if this kid goes to the school nurse or counselor and says, I'm stressed out about my gender or my gender identity, and the nurse says, well, you're actually a boy, right? If it's a girl child and she says this and the nurse says, you're a boy, why wouldn't the kid believe it, right? And so then it goes right down the path to immediate affirmation. As we all know, the kid gets sent to a gender clinic, the kid gets prescribed puberty blockers. The parents are very frequently stunned and in a state of shock and don't know what to do. So when we have an entire society, which we definitely have in the States, where our government is telling us that transgender is real, our businesses are all selling the idea that transgender is real. These kids are being taught this in schools. It's being reconfirmed in places of worship. And it's almost like I have the opposite question for you, which would be not how are these kids getting so indoctrinated, but how could they not be, given the extent to which society has been fully infected by the idea that sex isn't real? So that was a lot, but you asked me a lot. So yeah.
Yeah, we asked you a lot, and we then also went off on a slight. I'm going to try and bring the two conversations together, because essentially you've both said that this is not just a psychological experience, but a political and cultural phenomenon as well. To some degree, you've both alluded to how it works on language, even though you differ on how we should address that, or whether we should engage with that, and to what degree we should engage with that. What would you say to Stella, but those like Stella who have a very, very deep connection to the experience of gender dysphoria, and who engage with people who have all different points of this journey and come at this from different political angles, including men who present and transition into women and have said that they do experience autogynephilic or fetishization of themselves as women? Is your position then that we need to completely dissent and disconnect from this ideology? Or do you see why people need to kind of embrace parts of it pragmatically in order to work in this field?
So this is why I question whether there is one cohesive movement. And by that, I mean, Women's Declaration International is grounded in radical feminism. As such, we are a political and legal movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls as a sex class, right? And so that includes women of all races, ethnicities, religions, national origins. It includes heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual women and girls, right? It includes all women and girls as a sex class. That's what's important to me, and that's what I spend my time fighting for. We in the States, we do this all the time in terms of presenting testimony before state legislatures that are designed to protect women and girls as a sex class. We have done relentless advocacy before Congress to oppose a bill that would replace the word sex with the words gender identity throughout all federal US civil rights law. And we've done a lot of advocacy in the courts, and we are sticklers about language. We are, because we think that as a strategy, if we're interested in getting rid of so-called gender identity throughout the law, we have to ourselves be very disciplined in how we use language. So that's the movement of which I'm a part and of which I want to continue being a part. And, I will also say, my background is in political science and the law. And so that's sort of natural that I would want to do that. Whether other people want to engage in conversations about the validity of all these concepts that we're talking about really isn't for me to say. I just want to stick with what I'm doing, which is working throughout the US political and legal arenas to protect women and girls as a sex class. And in order to do that, we have to name women and girls as a sex class. And that covers all sorts of things. It covers protecting women and girls from the threats of gender identity. It also requires protecting the reproductive integrity of women and girls, which is a big fight in the States, having lost Roe v. Wade.
So when you say you're a stickler for language, how would you engage with the subject of gender with people who identify as trans? Do you use a different lexicon? Do you say trans identified males, etc.?
I just say men if I'm talking about men.
Yeah, but like if you just say men and you're talking about men, you could be talking about American men, and you might need to say American men because you're talking in Congress and you need to be more specific. You could be talking about a detransitioned man who's been devastated by medical transition, and so you need to add more detail. And to say it feels to me very bland to just say I'm just talking about men, because you then add layers to the man you're talking about, and you're talking about a specific type of man, and that man might be a rapist, and so you might add that detail in. And so for people to kind of continuously say, I'm just talking about men, or I'm just talking about women in that context, I'm saying, yeah, you no doubt add more detail to that point if you're making a complex point. Like I say, there might be a rapist in a prison, and you might need to add that point to it. Or you might say they're presenting as a woman. I do think that it's very important to clarify, because there's an awful lot of myths and untruths going around, and I think it's no accident that it's happening. And I think, it's no accident that it's happening. We
What do you mean
in
by
our
that?
gender framework, I just want to make my point. In our gender framework, we very much say that there's such thing as sex-based rights. And so chapter 4 is about society, and we argue very succinctly, and I think very well, for the need to always prioritize sex-based rights over gender identity. So basically your gender identity can be a parachute, it can be a kite, it can be a house. I don't care what your gender identity is. Sex-based rights have to have priority. So you can acknowledge the existence of something without bowing down to it and pandering to it and becoming some sort of dope in the face of it. You can just say that it Some people are talking about their gender identity. I live in Catholic Ireland. I often see Father O'Keefe down the road. I say, how are you, Father? I don't think he's my father. I see nuns. I say, how's it going, Sister Mary? How's things? The weather's good. I don't think she's my sister. So I'm very well accustomed to saying Happy Christmas to people and not believe that it's Jesus Christ's birthday or whatever the hell, or it's coming up to Easter and I don't think he's rose again. But
isn't this more a case of
people.
us saying Jesus, our Lord and Savior?
No, it's not. If I say Father with a very obsessed linguistic movement, it's the same as saying trans woman and being told that I'm basically as bad as any autogynephile rapist in a prison. No, I'm not saying Jesus, our Lord, our Savior. I might just sometimes give lip service to Christianity because I'm trying to get my point, and my point is more important than getting into the weeds. I think Winston Churchill did a great quote, and I'm going to mangle it, but it's something along the lines of, you won't win the war if you're busy fighting a kicking every dog. You know what I mean? You've got to sometimes lip service something and move on. But I want to make a point around that. What we have landed on in Spect, and and I want to talk as well about the movement as such, because I think it's a very good point Cara was making there. We basically have landed on the fact that and we say it very clearly on our website, but because a lot of this so-called movement is on Twitter, they can't seem to move from Twitter to a website. So therefore, we've been told our messaging is unclear. But if you looked at our website and if you looked at our position, it's quite clear that sex-based rights, sex is absolutely categorical. And it is one of the objective realities that we cling to and we are very, very based upon. But an easy rule of thumb, and I've no doubt Cara will agree with me, but I think it's important that we discuss our differences as well as our agreements. We believe that sex is, your male or female, your reproductive class, and the gender is some sort of social construct, more like masculinity or femininity. So sex, you could be male, and you could be feminine male, as in that's your gender. Your gender is your social construct. Or you could be female, which is your sex class, and your gender, and I know you won't agree with me, Cara, but give me a second to talk about where I'm coming from. And the gender would be your masculinity or femininity. So I could be a masculine woman. And so what? There are certainly an awful lot of, for want of a better word, feminine boys. Now, other people would say, don't use the word feminine, don't use the word masculine, because that's buying into a social construct. And I'm like, it's a social construct I buy into. As quite a masculine woman, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I don't really care whether somebody wants to call me assertive or masculine. It's like, yeah, they're different words, they have different connotations. I think my mother's quite feminine, but she was very sporty. I don't think they are words without worth. I think they do connotate certain things in our mind, like a very feminine female suggests certain things. That's where we've landed. But I think it's very interesting, the war around sex and gender, for example, in England and Ireland, they've basically kind of amalgamated the two. So sex means gender in England. That's the legal position. And so we've got an issue around that. And then in Ireland, they've made a ham-fisted view of it. So sex is sometimes used and then sometimes gender is used without any discerning. So I'd like more clarification in the language. I would like if sex was sex and gender was the social construct of masculinity or femininity. I think that's something to work with. But before you jump in, I just want to make the last point because I don't want to forget it. About the movement, I think it's a tragedy that there isn't a movement. I think it's a really sad fact that people from across different divides, I'm not a radical feminist and I'll never be one. But I would love if that we had the idea, just like allies have in many different times of history, they had the discernment to realize sometimes it's good to join together with people you don't really agree with on loads of things. Irish history was a big one. There was a socialist movement and a nationalist movement, and they joined together to fight against the English. Sometimes it's very, very important that you club together because there's something massive happening. And I think this is one of those times. And I call on people to, yeah, I know we disagree, but actually there's something bigger happening and let's get there.
Stella, I'm really glad you added that in because I wanted to ask you, is this about ultimately the goals of these different sides of this movement are not shared. For
Can
example,
can I just jump in before that? Because I think that's a crucially important question, but I do just want to respond to Stella. So it will not surprise you to know that I get in all sorts of trouble in the United States for working with conservative women's organizations when I'm not a conservative. And we have wildly different views about things like abortion, same-sex attracted rights. We have wildly different views on a lot of topics. But in order to push back against so-called gender identity in the law and society, we have made common cause to do that. Just very recently, there was an NCAA Division III championship where a young man was competing in a women's track category, and several of us from WDI USA, from the Independent Women's Forum, which is a largely moderate to conservative women's group, Concerned Women for America, which is definitely an anti-abortion conservative women's group, and we joined together to go to a rally to protest the male athletes' participation in the rally and to stand up for the female athletes. So I am happy to do that. And if we can do that here, then great. I think that's fantastic. But then I come to the question that was just posed, which is, do we ultimately have the same goal? I don't know. Like, I'd love to have that.
Let's explore that. Yeah. So, Cara, are you ultimately campaigning for a world where the mythology, ideology, pseudo-religious concepts around gender are removed from public life entirely?
Well, that's the immediate goal. The more ultimate goal would be the complete liberation of women and girls. And I would argue, I think it's pretty consistent with what Stella had to say. From a radical feminist perspective, gender, including words like femininity and masculinity, are prisons that society imposes on men and women on the basis of sex. And so nonconformity with such stereotypes is encouraged by radical feminism. And so tons of the women in our movement refuse to conform to sex stereotypes. I conform to some and not others. I'm wearing a little bit of makeup here today because I'm on camera. In my normal daily life, I don't wear a bit of makeup. I wear pants and flat shoes. I don't wear high heels. So, we all engage in some of these things to a certain extent. And women in our movement are encouraged to challenge themselves and challenge, including myself, the extent to which we participate in femininity to get outside those stereotypes. I think that's pretty consistent with what Stella was saying. But so, yes, the ultimate goal of radical feminism is to liberate women and girls. And because of where we are in society today, although, that looks like a lot of things. It looks like the end of prostitution and other forms of sex trafficking. It looks like the end of the viciousness of pornography. It looks like the complete enshrinement of women's reproductive rights in the law. But because of where we are in society today, we have to be taking on this thing called gender identity, which is threatening women and girls as a sex class. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. I'm keen to hear if there are any differences we can dig into with Stella's answer.
Remarkably few. I don't see massive differences. I don't come from a radical feminist standpoint, but I'm glad there are radical feminists. I think, it's a very worthy and interesting concept that certainly should be given a lot of credence. I'm very much rooted in mental health. And so I'm interested in the people who are in pain. And they will always be the people who I have most sympathy and regard for. So Spect isn't a psychological organization. We're an advocacy group. We're just trying to promote, a healthy approach to sex and gender, which is a non-medicalized approach to gender dysphoria, for want of a better phrase. So that is, it's kind of got a bit of a root in mental health. If you follow me, it's a healthy approach. It's non-medicalized. It's kind of psychological, but we don't just do psychology. I feel like I'm rambling here. I'm not sure. Yeah, I do agree with mostly what Cara said. Yeah.
I guess sometimes it's quite ironic with campaigning and charities and NGOs that their ultimate goal is to make themselves obsolete. Would that be?
Can I take you up on that? Because there's been an extraordinary smear campaign carried out against me and against Spect. And it's rooted in me, to be honest. So the more we can get public faces that are not me for Spect, the better. But it became because I did a film in 2018 and I was a psychotherapist and I had a background in mental health. I'd had my own issues with sex and gender as a kid. and had gone on to become a psychotherapist who just wrote about parenting and children and things like that. And I did this, and the point of the whole film, it's called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, and I'd like if you linked it so people could watch it for themselves, because the entire smear campaign has been driven from this film. So I'd like people to watch it so they know what they're talking about. And it was because the entire concept of the film, and Cara will like the concept, which was, could any of this 4,000% rise in girls seeking medical transition, could any of them be like me, who grew up to become comfortable in their own skin and did not medically transition? So that was the premise.
So is that's the aim of your organization, essentially?
No, that was my film in 2018.
But just to link it back, would that be your ultimate goal?
No, but we're not focused on girls now. Now we're just saying, why not just have a non-medicalized approach to gender diversity? You don't need to medically transition. I don't care how much you feel like a man or feel like a woman or feel like a boy or a girl. You don't need to medicalize it, because that's an unhealthy approach. So that we've way dispensed on that. But the film premise was, could any of this 4,000% girls be like me? And so we interviewed a range of people to figure that out. I did not know what autogynephilia was. I'd never heard of the concept, and I wasn't alone in 2018 in not knowing what autogynephilia was. Funnily enough, I had a client who I now know had autogynephilia in about 2015 or something, and it was a few years ago. And I didn't know what it was, but I worked with this client. Do you follow me? He didn't medically transition, for anybody who wants to know. Yeah, so I did not know what it was, and I didn't know that when I was speaking with Debbie Hayton. I didn't know there was even a concept called autogynephilia.
Yeah. We should
but
probably clarify for Cara, did you see the Debbie Hayton kind of debacle in the UK?
Which one?
Okay, great.
Can I make my point, because
Yep.
that will just steer it off into something. If you don't mind, I'd like to finish this point. So the film came out in 2018. It was November 2018, and in the film, I interview Debbie Hayton. The reason why we interviewed Debbie Hayton was one reason and one reason alone, which was to show a trans woman who did not agree with the medical transition of children. That was why I was in front of Debbie Hayton. No other reason. Had nothing in the notes said autogynephilia. Nothing in it. Turned out when we went to visit Debbie Hayton, it turned out that I came across a family in devastation. And because I'm mentally health kind of fixated, I immediately said, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I started asking questions like, this has been devastating on this family. And it was beautiful that the children came downstairs, and you could see their faces were very moved, because they were hearing for the first time the truth of what had happened, and their mother's distress at everything. And we very much platformed the distress of the mother. So we segued. The premise of the film was children shouldn't medically transition. It's not a good thing. But for that scene, we just suddenly segued into, hey, by the way, if a man transitions, the family can be devastated. Look at this. You know what I mean? And we very much shone a spotlight on this point. And we had one camera. So we were filming everything out of sequence. So, for 3 hours, it might be on me, then 3 hours on Debbie, and 3 hours on Stephanie, who's Debbie's wife. But anyway, I've been absolutely smeared and lied about and defamed and slandered by an awful lot of people who would have the very same object that I have, which is to stop medical transition, especially for young people and children and vulnerable adults. And they have done it because I was basically talking with Debbie Hayton, which in certain purists' view makes me a murderer, almost makes me a dreadful person, because I spoke with Debbie Hayton and I didn't basically spit on Debbie Hayton. And also they believe that they're some sort of geniuses because they figured out Stephanie Hayton, Debbie's wife, was devastated. And it's like, I showed you that with my questions. I actually showed you that. So no, you didn't figure that out. I actually showed it to you in my film, but they think I was crass because I asked Stephanie, are you a lesbian? What I was really asking, it was a polite way to say, are you having sex? Because I knew people want to know that, because it was the first film that brought detransition to the mainstream TV. And I wanted to ask the question that people are afraid to ask. And one of them is, well, what happens when somebody medically transitions? That's awful. And Stephanie answered very clearly, no, we're not, which I thought was very, very important for the public to know that. I think it's a very big question. And I also was shot for saying, well, we can see that medical transition doesn't work later in life. Now let's look at medical transition early in life. That's called a rhetorical device in a film. But by many people in our so-called movement, that was another reason to act as if I'm some sort of, what would you call it, double agent who's secretly trying to trans kids and who believes in true trans. And this kind of idea, Stella believes in true trans, is like, Stella said maybe 100, maybe 200 times that I don't believe in true trans. How many actually times do I have to be accused of that and to write essays and to say it in videos and for that to go? So there's a really horrible element. And okay, we don't call it a movement. What do we call it? In people who all want the same thing, who believe that trans ideology is a pernicious belief system and should be stopped. And if we're not going to be a movement, what are we? We're a bunch of people who are all arguing about different, very, very academic points, because I don't think that's very strategic.
Okay, so speak to Debbie Hayton versus spit on Debbie Hayton, I think you just said.
I'm not saying speak to Debbie Hayton. I'm not saying spit on Debbie Hayton. I'm saying spit on me for speaking to her or him in 2018. Okay?
Can you just say that again? Because I interrupted you and I think that's quite powerful. So you're saying it's not
I'm saying don't spit on me, if you don't mind, for speaking to Debbie Hayton in 2018, because I was trying to do something. It was a film that was trying to get to the masses, and we're still trying to get to the masses. And now it's 2024. I can see why we don't get to the masses, because we're busy fighting about other points when we should have got out to the general public. I think we are not a very strategic group of people.
So, and I think it did seem, certainly from where I was standing, that in some ways you were a victim of something that happened later, which was that Debbie Hayton then became very sympathetically platformed or profiled at a point at which this debate had really come down to truth in language and sex realism in language, and around the extent to which orthogynophilic, cross-dressing, trans-identified males should be able to permeate public life. And because he was a teacher who had been known to ask his students to call him Miss, there was a whole child protection and safeguarding element that came in. And I definitely saw that your film actually went back to a slightly different era, if we can call it that, in this sort of internet age. It was 5 minutes ago, but it really was a different time in the movement. But let's just stay with then that idea of platforming versus complete disassociation from men like Debbie Hayton. Cara, you've argued, or you haven't argued for, but your organization does not really engage with trans-identified men in any way by virtue of its focus, you say. Is that deplatforming, or is that just not associating with people for pragmatic reasons?
So as you say, we're a radical feminist organization that centers the voices of women. And so we just don't platform men. We do platform women and girls who have so-called detransitioned. I don't know when this will go up, but we should say today is Detransition Awareness Day. We have a new caucus, that consists of desisted and detransitioned women. And they just today announced a desisted and detransitioned women's Bill of Rights, which we're very proud of. So again, for us, it just keeps coming back to focusing on women and girls as a sex class, including women and girls who refer to themselves as trans, and including women and girls who have come back to embracing the fact that they're female. I know we're close to time. I am somewhat feeling like I'm being held responsible for the maybe unprofessional or immature behavior of some Twitter users, and I would prefer not to be, because I don't think that WDI has ever had any criticism of Gen Spect. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think I've responded to the points, but maybe I haven't.
I suppose I'm looking for more of an analytical view on whether engaging with men like Debbie Hayton by definition constitutes platforming from your perspective. And I don't mean to invite the kind of criticism which I think Stella is very rightly highlighting as, you know, really self-destructive to this movement. But if there is a point of philosophical departure between you both, what is it?
Okay, good question. So as I said, WDI doesn't platform men at all. So we don't face the question of whether to platform men with autogynephilia. A different question, which I have never confronted, is whether I would share a platform, someone else's platform, with a man with autogynephilia. Since I've never, and part of the reason I've never asked that question is because the US media refuses to platform radical feminist turfs, if you like. It's extremely difficult to get a conversation in the mainstream United States media. If someone ever were to platform a man who refers to himself as a woman and also invite me to participate in that discussion, that would be a really interesting question. I can't say for sure, but at this moment, I think I would be inclined to accept that invitation. I know there was a recent media platform where Helen Joyce was asked to participate with Fred Wallace, and she did so not knowing that he was going to be on the platform, and that caused all sorts of problems. And I believe, Helen, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, I believe she ended up saying she regretted that decision in that instance. I hope I've got that right. But these are all really good questions.
Sorry, Cara, if I'm holding you responsible for all the grief I got, because I really shouldn't, or WDI. I do think that an extraordinary purity spiral has happened, and I'm very much the target of it. So, for example, a man called Phil Illy, who identifies as a man, who uses he, him, who goes to the men's toilets, wore a dress at the Spect conference. He was not platformed because he wasn't on a platform. He was attending the conference. He happened to bring his book, but most people who've written a book tend to bring a book to their conference. Do you know what I mean? We weren't selling the book. We weren't promoting it. We did take a photo of Phil Illy at the conference at the behest of a detransitioned woman who requested the photo to go out online. And for that, we have, you know, we are still massively smeared. I see Jennifer Bilek wrote an article saying that we're the new Deplatforming or something today. And I don't even know what to say to that. We're advocating for a healthy approach to sex and gender, which is prioritizing or focusing completely on a non-medicalized approach to sex and gender. How the hell are we a second Deplatforming? I think it's incredibly offensive and ill-informed of Jennifer Bilek to say that. And also, I can't help but thinking, by the way, somebody needs to follow the money. But whoever's been following the money, they haven't succeeded in following it yet. Like, I've been here and followed the money for 6 years. Nobody seems to have figured out in that, well, who is funding Deplatforming? Because I've kind of done my own research to make me think this is something that really needs to be followed. So maybe Jennifer Bilek would be better off doing her homework and following the money as she says she does. So we actually know what's happening with the funding of Deplatforming. Why don't we know the answer? She's been doing it for 6 years. Why isn't she? Why don't we know the funding at this stage? Why is she going on about Spect, which is quite clearly, by the way, just to fill in a couple of gaps, 2018 happened, and then I was inundated with an awful lot of people who were in deep distress. And a couple of years later, after COVID, I founded Spect because I realized, oh my God, we need to get together. I don't naturally run organizations. I've kind of had a few businesses. I don't like running an organization. I want to be a lone wolf. It doesn't particularly suit me, but this is too important. But having people kind of dragging on you because you've got slight differences is kind of pretty devastating and incredibly self-destructive. But one last point, and I know I'm ranting, but I suppose I'm agitated by articles like Jennifer Bilek. It's like, what are we doing? What are we actually doing as a movement? And apparently we're not a movement. Why are we not a movement? Why are we not coming together to work to an objective, which would be to stop the fast-track medicalization and to get back to reality, to prioritize sex-based rights, and to kind of highlight the fact that if gender exists, it's a social construct in people's minds. If you follow me, why are we not pulling together? Why are we not a movement? Why would we resist being that? But, you know, I'm friendly with Kira Bell. She's a detransitioned woman. And I did an article for Detrans Awareness Day, and thank you, Cara, for highlighting it. I really should have highlighted it myself. But I did an article with Kira today. We released it today. And, you know, Kira has really, she's the person I'm working with. I'm not working with Kira, but I'm working with so many detransitioners over the years. And I think the complexity of their existence has been completely negated. So Kira says it in the article, you know, she was told by women in women's movements, you pass as a woman, you should go into the women's toilets. And she was thrown out of many women's toilets. As a detransition woman, she's been thrown out of women's toilets. And she realized it wasn't helpful for women and it wasn't helpful for her to go into women's toilets because she does not pass as a woman, because she's got facial hair and body hair and a masculinized expression. And so she started using the men's toilets where she does not get thrown out of. So to kind of simplify everything rather than understanding this is a profoundly complex situation, because the fact is testosterone is a beast that absolutely masculinizes women. We have an issue. There's an androgynous appearance that doesn't have a space, that perhaps I would argue needs a third space. But we have an issue with that. We definitely cannot pretend that everybody passes. All these females, all these sex-based females are going to pass as females, because they don't. Kira's one of them. She's staying in my house. I could bring her in right now and she'd say, no, I don't. So what are you going to do with that?
Can I ask you one thing, that just out of curiosity, if I was a parent with a gender dysphoric child, is there anywhere I can go with that child, therapeutic or medical, that does not enter into the concept of gender?
Well, if you're thinking therapeutically, Spect has a wing which is beyond trans, and we offer therapy. We offer funding for therapy for people who've been harmed by medical transition. That's mostly detransitioners, but not only detransitioners. And people who've been harmed by medical transition can be helped with therapy, not always, but they can be. And every therapist listed on our Beyond Trans directory has signed up to prioritizing, you know, a non-medicalized approach to gender, so they could go to that.
But they use the concept of gender and they're called Beyond Trans. They enter into it to some degree. No, but I take your point that that's kind of.
What would you? No.
Splitting hairs.
You tell me what we should say then. Go on.
Well, what if you started by saying we're with the majority who are not bought in to the ideology of gender, but so then why is there no secular spaces? If we're calling it an ideology, can I not, as a mother with a child who's deeply depressed and confused, find any public spaces, therapeutic
But what are they
groups
deeply, desperately confused about?
About their body and how they identify?
What if it's not about their body? What if it's completely the fact that they are presenting as a girl? It's not about their body. What if it's not about their body? It's about how they are presenting as a girl, but it's not body related. What would you call that?
Well, then it's about a social construct, as you say.
So what would you call it? How would they, when they ring up the therapist, what do they say?
Well, I mean, you can refer to the word gender as a concept, not entering into it as a social concept that they have then identified as something inside of them.
Okay. Yeah. So we called it Beyond Trans, and we said we'd give funding for therapy for people who've been harmed by medical transition. And you think we should have called it something different?
I guess what I'm, to be totally honest, is that it feels like when you add up the level of participation in the construct, in the language, in the people who are engaged to various degrees with their own journey through transitioning or presenting as the opposite sex or detransitioning, the level of engagement does come across as an entrenchment of the construct.
What are you saying, transitioning and detransitioning, if you think we shouldn't say transitioning and detransitioning? You're buying into the ideology by using those words.
But what I'm saying is the presentation of all those or platforming or presentation or association with those people and those words adds up to a kind of participation. Would you at least understand that?
It does.
And it
you're
comes across like that.
participating in it. So why
Yes.
are you participating in it?
Well, I'm referencing it in order to question you about it, but I don't think I would use those terms.
So what would you, you're a mother of a child who's distressed about the fact that there's a social construct out there that should not be named. And you want to ring up a therapist and you say, I'm not going to name the social construct that they are distressed about, but they're distressed about a social construct.
Well, I would say my daughter thinks that she's a boy, or my son thinks that he's a girl.
But if the therapist names that as something to do with reference and the fact that it's a gender issue, this is participating. While if you say
this is exactly my point. There's a gender issue referencing the cultural phenomenon of gender and the belief system, and there's gender issue as a real identity reality,
real social construct.
Well, the
like depression is a real social construct, as in people can be very, very depressed. It's self-reported. We can't open up the body to have a look. It's self-reported, okay? But we call it depression because it ticks a certain list, okay? You know what I mean? That you can't get out of bed or whatever, low mood, chronic low mood, whatever, you're eating or you're not sleeping or whatever. So yeah, there's an awful lot of social constructs in mental health that we call them different words for want of a better phrase.
I should bring this back to Cara as well. So is there any way to, if I can invite you to play devil's advocate for a moment, is there a version of Gen Spect or another kind of part of the movement or a therapeutic approach which can actively dissent from the construct, not buy into that kind of belief system and still reference it, work with it without entrenching it? Because well, that's what I'm asking, because it feels like a lot of the criticism you're getting. I have
to take you up on this. I'm sorry. How are we entrenching it? Are you saying by saying a word we're entrenching?
I think it definitely comes across that Gen Spect's approach is so liberal to the experiences, the subjective experiences of what we call gender, in order to do their work. And I understand the pragmatic element.
No. How are we so liberal to that? You have to give me something specific, because I don't think.
Well, we've just talked about all of that. Originally, there was a circumstantial film with an autogynephile. Then there's somebody at the conference.
2018. We were founded in 2021.
But even the prevalence of the word gender, I mean, I just went through the website, and the concept of gender and trans, referencing trans women, referencing transitioning, there doesn't seem to be a very loud voice coming through the organization, which is gender secular or dissenting from gender. It's very participatory in a way, which, and I totally understand the pragmatic reasons for that. And it may be that approach, if you're saying let's leave everyone to their strategy, I totally believe you should be left to your strategy. But what I'm saying is,
no, there isn't. To answer your question, no, there isn't. Not that
there isn't a way.
No.
But that
and
seems
God
to me...
help their branding is all I could say. I say that as somebody who doesn't believe in God. It's a cultural phrase, by the way, because sometimes we use phrases just to get the communication across. But I think it's much more important to communicate the truth than to get fixated on language. So therefore, when Sarah Phillimore wrote an article, she's a lawyer, and she communicated the truth. This is a man. I'm talking about a man. I'm communicating the truth. However, for this article, I'm going to use these words. That's much more important than getting fixated on the words you use. I don't think this is a linguistic movement. I think the trans movement was a linguistic movement. And frankly, it was an ivory-towered academic conceptual movement that didn't help anybody. We need to base ourselves on reality. So once you communicate the truth and you make sure that that's your North Star, I think that's much more important than using some words and not using others. Because do you know why? Because that's identity politics. I come from a world, in Northern Ireland, you know what I mean? Like if you use certain words, if you say Derry, you're a nationalist. If you say Londonderry, you're a unionist. If there's lots of different things in Derry Girls. If you had your toaster in the press, you're a unionist, and if you had it outside, you're.
Let's come back to Cara, because we actually, I know we're circling, but this idea of, for the purposes of this article, I'm going to use she, taking a pragmatic approach. This is something that you've kind of campaigned against and been very actively vocal against. Is there a way, do you agree with what Stellas has said? Is there a way for organizations to engage in any way with sufferers and gender dysphoric children, but totally exit the ideology and its linguistic framework?
So I had a conversation with Andrew Doyle and Sarah on Free Speech Nation, and I just disagree with Sarah as a practical matter, because she takes the view, and I understand what she's saying, that once she said he's a man and then proceeded to use the pronouns throughout, her point, her argument is that since she said the truth that he's a man, that should be sufficient. I just don't think that's true as a practical matter. I think that as an ordinary person reads through that article and sees the references to she and her, it's going to be difficult psychologically for an ordinary reader to remember that he's a man. Of course, she said so up front. She did. Absolutely. I'm not denying or contesting any of that. So when I'm writing a brief to be filed before a United States Court of Appeals, I just consistently use sex accurate pronouns for the specific reason that I want the judges who are going to be reading that brief to understand what's going on here. If I'm talking about a man being housed in a women's prison, I want it to be very clear. I want them to understand that we're talking about men in women's prisons. I want them to understand that we're talking about men in women's sports. I want them to understand that we're talking about men in women-only places of public accommodation, which is a case that I'm working on right now. And I worry that if I compromise on the use of pronouns, that the judges will just be confused because they are not immersed in all of this stuff about sex and gender. And that if I compromise on pronouns, the judges will think I'm talking about a woman, even if I say up front that I'm talking about a man. Now, that's just where I come from as a lawyer practicing on behalf of WDI USA in the United States. That's my thinking about why I communicate in the way that I do. I understand there's an argument that it's practical to persuade people by using compromised language. I totally get the argument. I just don't share it because in my experience, we are having much more success communicating with the persuadables just by using sex-specific language. So this isn't a purity test. This is actually, my argument would be that this is a matter of strategy. This is a matter of finding the best strategy to win if the goal is getting so-called gender identity out of law, policy, and society. At least in the States, normie Americans understand. We did some polling. WDI USA did some polling recently showing that 4 out of 5 voters across the political spectrum in the United States understand that the statement, a woman is an adult human female, is a true statement. What that means is they're pretty much already with us. And what they need is to be persuaded that it's okay to call a man a man. They don't know that yet. They think they're still being compelled, and they are being compelled to use sex inaccurate language, but they're already with us. They know the emperor has no clothes. And part of what I view WDI USA's job and other radical feminists is to provide examples of using sex-specific accurate language to give normal people who don't follow these things some permission to do that themselves. So that's why I do it. It's not because I'm in a purity spiral. It's not even an ideologically driven thing. It's really a tactic in WDI USA's efforts to win the movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls. And I'm not sure how we can protect the sex-based rights of women and girls if we're using inaccurate language.
Can I come in on that? Like, I very welcome Cara's very gracious response there. And I wish more people were like her, because we don't agree in strategy. I think our strategy is better than Cara's. Cara's thinks hers is better. But we have the, yeah. So what? Like, you know what I mean? May the best woman win. And isn't it great? We both want the same thing effectively. But I do want to clarify, I think it's very important to call a man a man. I think it's very important to support people who need to call a man a man. Absolutely. But what I want to know, for me, or for what I want to advocate for, is the freedom to speak as I wish, because free speech and the freedom to speak as I wish is as important as anything to do with gender identity. And so I need to be able to speak the way I want to speak. And I don't want to speak the way anybody else speaks, because that's how I come to better thoughts, when I can work things out. And sadly, most people aren't as gracious as Cara in this scenario. And they tell me I have to speak in a certain way. And if I don't, I will get smeared and I will be told I'm some sort of autogynephile, handmaiden. And I will be abused and I'll be called all sorts of names. And huge leaps of logic move from the fact that sometimes I want to think my thoughts, because I'm immersed with detransitioners, and detransitioners who are basically presenting as male, even though they've stopped testosterone, and they're using the male toilets, and they're in an awful complex place. And I'm not getting fixated on pronouns with those people. I'm getting fixated on a larger truth, which is the freedom for people to speak the truth as and when they wish, and to defend that freedom. And to me, that's bigger than anything to do with sex, gender, and other kind of aspects around that. I do think that prohibition doesn't work. I think that prohibiting people to use certain words and to say, I'm only going to, ally with an organization that does not use words A, B, and C, and D, I think it's very, very toxic. I think it's very unhealthy. And I think it's a very narrow-minded, unstrategic approach. And I also think that it's really quite condescending, sorry, Cara, to think that normies or judges or whoever else won't understand. If you start with, this is a man, this is a man, this is a man, they were born as a male. And now, by the way, I'm going to go on and call them something else. By the way, I don't take that approach. People think I do, because I've been lied and smeared about all the time. I say man, he, whatever. I say whatever I want, basically. But what I don't like is being compelled speech, I think, is toxic. And I think it's really, really unhealthy. And that's, I think, something that Jen Spect, don't forget, ours is a healthy approach. And so we're very, very into the freedom for people, especially a distressed mother or a detrans woman. Let them speak how they want. Just get to the truth is more important than the language they use to get to the truth.
I mean, I guess I just think that language is part of truth. And I don't think that people yelling at you on Twitter constitutes speech compulsion.
You don't?
No.
And do you think articles that basically say that we are WPATH and things like that, and that, let's say if hundreds of people are sharing it and everybody's come, you don't think that it amounts to anything? So therefore, you would say that trans activists, it's no big deal. It's no biggie.
Well, to be fair, trans activism is embedded in the law now. So you can have police at your door, and you can lose your job, and you can have your child completely socially ostracized, or you can have a school come after you. That's slightly different from Twitter backlash, even if the language is
no. How did that happen? It happened from a mass movement of people. It was a cultural kind of, it kind of got in some way. You know what I mean? To pretend that masses of people speaking at you and all saying the same thing doesn't carry weight is disingenuous.
So the city of Dallas mandates preferred pronouns for city employees. Mm-hmm. That's probably unconstitutional, and I hope some city employee challenges it constitutionally. To me, that is speech compulsion. And I guess I just think you do have the absolute right to say whatever you want on Twitter, and everyone else has the absolute right to argue with you if they want to, right? I mean, Twitter's an interesting platform. I typically don't engage with people who are criticizing me on Twitter. That's just how I approach it. I don't want to, in part because I'm not savvy enough with the platform.
Have you been subject to a smear campaign from your own side for the last 7 years?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? Well, I haven't seen it.
Absolutely. But in this case,
are they saying lies about you? What are the lies they're saying?
Sure. In this case, my own side refers to so-called gender critical radical feminists who hate me for working with conservatives. And so, yeah, they say all sorts of horrible things about me. But I do just want to say, I have not read the article that Jennifer Billick tweeted this morning, so I cannot speak to that at all. But I do want to say, I don't know who funds WPATH, but there can be no doubt that Jennifer Billick has done some extraordinary work exposing the funding that has come from men like Tim Gill, from men like Martine Rothblatt, and for men like Jennifer Pritzker, who are some of the wealthiest men in America and who have been funding so much of this. And we wouldn't know that were it not for her work. So I didn't want to end this program by at least not mentioning that.
Yeah. Well, I know that she did some work on Ireland that wasn't accurate, so I'm not so impressed with the diligence of her work. And I know how she's spoken about me and Jen Spect, and she's definitely lied about me and Jen Spect, and she definitely had inaccuracies about what she said about Ireland. So she might be brilliant on those people, and I actually have read those, and I think it's a phenomenal piece of work. But I don't think she's done herself any favors by casting aspersions on Jen Spect, which is provable by just reading our website.
So I don't know what she has said about Jen Spect. I haven't read the article from this morning. She's not here to defend herself. I just wanted to make the point that there really can't be any doubt that she has done some of the best work exposing the money behind the gender
Why
identity.
don't we know anything about the funding of WPATH?
I don't do that research.
Following the money, and we still haven't got an answer, not even one.
I can't answer that. That's not my focus. I don't know.
It's her focus.
I know where the funding initially came from. I know where the funding came from in the 1970s when it.
We all know that.
Well,
Erickson or Reed, whatever his name was.
Yeah,